Good afternoon, everyone. It is so exciting to be here with you. I'm coming to you live from my home office in San Diego, but we have a really exciting panel for you. We are going to have a discussion today about getting out the vote. My name is Janessa Goldbeck. My pronouns are she and her. And today we're going to be discussing the importance of voting for the LGBTQ community with local community leaders. At this time, I'd like to welcome our guests. I'll start by calling on each of you so you can share your name, pronouns, and any relevant affiliations you'd like to share today. So with us today, we have Jessica Meyer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Meyer. I am here on my own time during my lunch break in my kitchen. I am not here on my official capacity as Congresswoman Susan Davis's district director, but I'm also part of the Stonewall Citizens Patrol, where I'm the secretary there. Part of Manada San Diego and a bunch of different organizations, and I'm really glad to be here and looking forward to this really great discussion.
And Jessica and I have been friends for a while, and I just mispronounced her last name, so sorry about that, Jessica.
Yeah, that's fine. Meyer, Mid, whatever you like to call it, totally fine.
We'll go with Jessica, I guess. Perfect. Okay. We also have Joshua Stickney.
Hey, Janessa. My name is Josh Stickney. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the Deputy Communications Director at Equality California, where I lead our organization's digital, electoral, and political work. So Equality California is the nation's largest statewide LGBTQ plus civil rights organization, which of course means we are very active and engaged on anything in the San Diego area, but across the Golden State and even at the federal level. So really excited to be here to talk about everything election.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. We also have Makana Rowan.
Hi, Makana Rowan here. He, him, his. I am also here on my lunch break as representing myself as an individual, but my work is I'm the Director of Community Engagement and the LGBTQ plus liaison at the Office of Supervisor Nathan Fletcher.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Makana. And last but not least, we've got Tyler Renner with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tyler Renner, he, him, his. I'm Director of Community Outreach for San Diego City Council member Chris Ward, who represents District 3.
Right on. Awesome. And I guess I forgot to let you know who I am as well. In a volunteer capacity, I'm the organizing director right now for California Military Families and Veterans for Biden, as well as a member of the Women Veterans Council for Biden. So I'm doing everything I can right now to help get out the vote. So that brings us to the topic of our discussion today. We're going to have a panel discussion addressing some previously submitted questions, and depending on time, we may have the opportunity to answer questions from the audience. So please feel free to engage with us in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you're watching. I also want to mention before we get started that San Diego Pride is calling and texting folks to make sure that the voices of LGBTQ plus and allied voters are heard in this election. We've still got 5 more text and phone banks to go from today through the election. So if you want to join us, and I highly recommend it, it's a lot of fun. There's one tonight at 5:30 p.m. It's entirely remote. We connect to each other over Zoom while we make calls and texts straight from our computers at home. So you can find out more information and sign up at sdpride.org/vote. And the link will be at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so I'm going to open it up with a question to all of you. Feel free to just jump right in. Voting is a right that all eligible Americans should exercise, but why do you think it's especially important for LGBTQ plus voters to exercise this right? What is on the line if we don't show up to the...
I'll jump in. So I know that LGBTQ plus voters are more likely to support diverse candidates, like it's significantly more likely in groups like Black, Latinx, LGBTQ plus, obviously. So if we don't show up to the polls, that representation of getting a more diverse, accurate representation of who we are as an entire community disappears.
I also think it's very important to be involved, particularly now. We've heard some of the most homophobic, anti-immigrant rhetoric we've ever heard from the White House. And we really need to put the voices of people of color, our transgender and LGBTQ community in the forefront, because if we're not at the forefront of that, then our elected officials can't be held accountable for that. So we need to make sure that we vote, that we all vote. I'm an ally, and as an ally, I have family who are LGBTQ, and I need to make sure that their voices are also heard, and that I'm helping them elevate their voices too.
Yeah, and I think every election is important, but literally this year, everything is on the line, from LGBTQ rights, reproductive justice, immigration reform, the environment, everything. But one of the most important things, I think, that this election is going to set the tone for our next generation. The current president is veering towards fascism, authoritarianism, and there's just no norms left in our politics. Toxicity has become the norm. And, I think public service is a noble calling. He's turned it into a circus, a reality show, and a pulpit to hurt our most vulnerable communities. So we have an opportunity to take that back and reset the tone, to make sure that we're actually caring for the most vulnerable people in our society, and that our democracy actually works for everyone, including folks in the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, and to follow up what Tyler said, I think it's important to show that Americans are not going to stand for that particular kind of rhetoric where we demean each other and pin each other against one another. And I think that when we vote, to not have that kind of language coming out from our elected officials, it shows them that we will not stand for that as the people who they're supposed to be representing.
I think it also trickles down. Unfortunately, the administration and the courts have decided that our community is a punching bag, and we're dummies for debate. But unfortunately, our humanity is not up for debate, and the only way that we can impact that is by voting. And when we talk about top down, I mean that the rhetoric we're seeing in DC is unfortunately coming down at state and local levels. We're seeing candidates, we're seeing folks, policymakers use that really anti-LGBTQ, anti-civil rights rhetoric. And it's going to affect all of us. So I really appreciate the question, Janessa. I think our humanity is really at stake here.
Yeah, and I'll just echo some of what Josh said too. It's like, tiptoeing around my own political beliefs, but it's like I get flack for engaging in identity politics, and it's like, until my identity is not a part of politics, I'm gonna I don't care about voting with identity politics. It's there's a lot on the line for us, and especially on a local level. I mean, San Diego, this election is radical in that we're getting 5 new council people. We could have a majority Democratic Board of Supervisors for the first time in, I think, maybe ever or decades. I don't actually know the stat there, but which would give us a Democratic chair, and the county could become a radically different thing, a much more welcoming entity as a whole, and partnered with the Democratic mayor. So exciting.
I think that's a great segue to our next question. We often hear about voting, quote, down your ballot, which means that beyond just the presidential election and voting on who our next president will be, voters should also be intentional about being informed about everything that's on our ballots, from ballot measures and propositions to our federal, state, and local representatives. So each of you have experiences in different areas of government. Tyler, you currently work in city government. Makana, you're at the county. Jessica, you have experience at the federal level. And Joshua, you work at the state. Can you all talk about why voters should stay up to date about everything that's on their ballot, and what else is on our ballots this year that voters should care about? Jessica, let's start with you.
Sure. I think from the federal side, obviously, you talk about your elected officials, and I work for Congresswoman Susan Davis, and we're going to be transitioning out, and a new member will be taking over the seat. I think it's important to make sure that people understand the importance of having contact with a congressional member, not just during election time, to be honest with you, but every year, every minute of every single time you have something that's federally in front of them. I think it's, we forget that federal offices have an ability to help individuals or having issues with federal agencies. I work on casework for immigration, which is very near and dear to me. And I work a lot on making sure that transgender immigrants are being treated fairly and equitable, particularly when they're detained by ICE. And so if you had a member who wasn't involved in issues like that, then it becomes hard for the staff, which would be me, to be involved in those issues as well if they don't care about them. Unfortunately, I have a member who really does care, and cares about the community she represents. Sorry, this is my cat who now feels like she needs to be in the spotlight. And so it's very important that we make sure that when you vote, when you look at your federal representative, you look at the values that they're gonna represent, what they're going to be taking a look in Congress, and then engaging with them again, not just during election time, but engaging with them when they're something comes up in Congress, to call your member of Congress. I think a lot of people don't think about, we hear people call us day in and day out, email us, write to us, tweet at us, whatever you want to call it, to make sure that their voices are heard. And that's really important, because we do look at that. Your member does look at that. And if you're not saying the things that are important to you, then we don't know what's important to you, and we can't represent you in that way. Or guess what? Your issue's not important enough to make it on the radar, and that's even worse. So we have to make sure that when we look and we're voting for people, that we vote our interest, and you have to define what your interest is. Your interest could be different than my interest, but it's still your interest, and you have to be aware of that and be engaged in that and be an informed voter. And again, you have to vote, you have to look at everything, and the propositions can affect you and your family for many, many years, decades actually, sometimes, depending on the proposition. So you need to make sure you look at those things. And I always take a look at not only the partisan, but I look at who's bipartisan or nonpartisan. I belong to the League of Women Voters as well, and they look at all of these things and kind of give a sense of a full understanding of what it looks like on both ends. So, it's just important to stay engaged as much as you can, when you can, however you can.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think that sometimes people forget that members of Congress are responsible for confirming, appointees to really important positions like the Supreme Court, but also agencies like the VA, that are looking at healthcare for LGBTQ plus service members. So these things really matter. And I really appreciate your perspective. Let's go to Josh at the state level. What are some things that folks should be aware of that are on their ballot this year at the state level?
Absolutely. Well, I just want to echo what Jessica said about voting your interests. And if you look at the California ballot, there are so many things on the ballot. Well, first off, the ballot's incredibly long, which can be intimidating to folks. But it's important to stay engaged, because if you just kind of throw your vote away on some of those things without kind of knowing what's behind them and the policy impacts behind them, you could be kind of throwing away your chance to make your voice heard on some really important issues. So the first thing I'll talk about are ballot propositions. Yes, there are many of them, and I would just tell folks to check who's funding those. I think it's always really interesting to see if allies and supporters of the LGBTQ community are funding them, if they're engaged or not. But just know that those affect real lives. Those affect people's jobs. Those often affect civil rights, as we know very well here in California. And then in addition to the ballot propositions, I would just say that having pro-equality leaders, and I do mean openly LGBTQ folks, but also our allies in Sacramento, is incredibly important to our LGBTQ community. And you all know very well in San Diego how having a lot of LGBTQ representation in Sacramento works, but not everyone in the state does. That's why we need to continue to elect our allies and LGBTQ folks into Sacramento. I'll just give you a really quick example. The state of California was not collecting any kind of data on sexual orientation or gender identity in the intake of COVID-19 patients. But thanks to folks like Assemblymember Todd Gloria, Senator Tony Atkins, and folks really up and down the legislature were able to get a bill passed and signed into law that would mandate that California collect and report this voluntary data related to sexual orientation and gender identity. This is cutting edge work, and folks being engaged and electing the right folks into Sacramento will help us pass this kind of first in the nation work that we did in this case.
That's excellent. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. And let's go over to Makana Rowan at the county. Same question to you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so much of what we think about and what we've already talked about is just protecting the identities of queer people and the right to exist for communities of color. But even beyond that, I look at voting for things like your Congress people, that those are people who are charged with bringing resources back from a federal level directly into your community. It's so important to stay informed in who's best equipped to make those things on the federal level, make those decisions and conversations that will make that happen. And beyond that, voting on propositions and things like that, that's giving you control over your tax dollars and how they're spent. From things like levying our taxes to protect our water quality down to our leadership and school level. I mean, that's the most direct way we can make decisions about what other people will do with our tax dollars.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just mention that, if you're looking at your ballot and you're kind of overwhelmed by how many local measures there are and propositions, there are a couple of great resources. The League of Women Voters that Jessica mentioned has a great voter guide. The California ACLU has a great voter guide. The San Diego Democratic Party has a voter guide. And my personal favorite is a website called calmatters.org, which is a nonpartisan website that sort of walks you through the propositions, shows you who's funding them, who's supporting them, who's opposing them, and helps you make an informed decision. And I'll go ahead and put in a plug for voting yes on Prop 16, which would restore affirmative action to California. We're one of 9 states in the country that doesn't allow gender or race to be factors in hiring for public jobs or education. So I wrote an op-ed about that in the Union Tribune about why it's important. I'm a veteran and I've benefited for it, but I think it's really important to educate ourselves on these statewide propositions. Okay, enough from me. Tyler, the city level, why should people be engaged in this election?
Yeah, definitely. So at the most local level, we get to vote on school board members, community college district representatives, city attorney, city council, your mayor, and local ballot measures. Kind of going through each one, your school board has a huge impact on LGBTQ students, on inclusive and affirming curriculum, resource equity, anti-bullying policies. Your city attorney, city council members, and mayor, they literally shape the landscape of your city. And that's access to utilities, housing, public safety, transportation. I think the protests and calls for racial justice this year have really highlighted the role of local government. It's your city council, it's your mayor, it's your city attorney who hire your police chief, create the police budgets, and enforce public safety policies. That happens at an immediate local level. Talking about ballot measures, there's a lot of things on the ballot, specifically for San Diego this year, so I'll touch upon some of the local ones. We have an opportunity to build affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness. We can reform police oversight, reform school board elections, and we have an opportunity to revitalize the Midway neighborhood through better land use planning. So I know land use and urban planning isn't the most sexy or compelling topic, but that literally dictates where housing is built, how transportation is built to access that, where job centers are, bike lanes, environmental planning, utility use. All of that affects the daily life of you, and it affects the generation after us. So at the most local level, you have a huge capacity to impact everything around your built environment, but also the policies that are going to affect the health and human services that are available in your region.
Tyler, I'm just going to vehemently disagree with you there. I think there's nothing sexier than land use policy, and we should all get into it. Okay, I'm going to go to our next question. Sometimes it's difficult to see our immediate results when we vote. There are folks that are disillusioned with voting, that the people who are running for office are not reflective of their values or don't perfectly align with the things that they believe are priorities. Why should people still vote and engage in the process, even if they don't completely 100% agree with the candidate on every issue or think that they represent all of their interests? Tyler, I'll start with you again.
Sure, yeah, I certainly know it's discouraging to vote for people that don't look like you, that don't have the same lived experience as you, to vote for people that already have access, privilege, and power. But I think it's crucial to elect people that align closest to your values and that at least share common approaches to solving some of the problems that are important to you. Once you elect a certain official, you can push them, you can hold them accountable. And that takes persistence and that takes frequent engagement with their office. So I would say look at who most closely aligns to your values. And then after that, hold their feet to the fire, stay engaged with them. We need to hear from diverse voices because the systems that we've created for government and for public feedback of decision making, there's a lot of barriers for diverse voices, for people of color, for LGBTQ folks, for working class people. And we don't hear from a lot of those people when we're making decisions. So the structures in place stay keeping people in power and privilege. So we need to make sure that we're persistent with our community engagement. That means going to town halls, your neighborhood, town council, calling your elected official. I know for the folks who work in elected official offices, we will answer your call. We will answer your email. We will get back to you. That is something that I don't think a lot of people have a lot of reassurance. But if you don't know how something works, or you really care about a certain issue, pick up the phone or email us. You'll get an answer, and you'll get a person that communicates that to their elected officials. So it's just important to make sure that you stay persistently engaged with folks, because elected officials are accountable to everyone, but they're most responsive to the people that engage with them.
Jessica and Lakana, I know you both have direct contact with constituents in your roles, and I was wondering if either of you could talk about a time that constituent engagement actually led to a real change, on the ground, and give us an example of how that actually makes a difference.
Sure. It really does. I can remember a few different, with our military families, we made, Susan is part of, Susan crafts the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. And we passed something in that bill that was a technical error for the way military families process their income. And so we heard it from a constituent who called and said, hey, this isn't working for me. I'm not sure why my income is counted this way. We went back and looked at that, and it was like, oh, they're right. This is a technical issue. If it impacts them, it might impact someone else. So we went back and fixed it so this doesn't impact people. So yes, when you call your member of Congress, or you call any of our offices for that matter, we really do look at what that looks like. And if you're calling us, then I'm sure there's thousands of people who are having the exact same issue. And we really do take to heart to figure out why that is. And again, we make legislation hopefully will work out and it's great. But sometimes we don't see something that should have been fixed on beforehand. And so we do look at those intended consequences and fix them when we can. I think that, just to follow what Tyler was saying, I think, one thing that we do really well, especially here in San Diego, is talk to the other offices. We really do engage with each other on a personal level, on a professional level. And so if we can't solve the issue you're having, we know who to call. We know who to refer you to. We know who to direct you to. And it makes it, when your elected officials work together locally because they agree that we should provide services to people, then it makes life a lot easier for everybody, including the constituent that we're trying to help. We're very constituent focused and constituent forward. And I think all the offices here in San Diego have that same philosophy, and their staff reflect the idea that they will help constituents, even if they have to go above and beyond what their normal call of duty is, because we are public servants and want to make sure that we're doing what we can to help people, because we're trying to represent them, and trying to engage them and keep them engaged. I also will say that, we think about how, you may be disillusioned with a member that you didn't like, or you didn't get, or president you didn't want. But we have to keep at it. We have to keep engaging. When we look at the House right now, the House is majority Democrat, and our chairmen are all Democrats. But the Senate side, we don't have that. We have Republican-controlled Senate, and so we have to keep, getting engaged with them to make sure that they bring up issues that matter to our community. And so we have to keep engaging. Our constituents call us. We call the Senate, and we tell them, hey, people are calling us. They want this done, and they want this done now. And so keep engaged, keep talking to us, and your voices do make a difference.
Yeah, and I'll add to that we know how hard that we work in public service, and we're always wearing so many hats and pulled into so many directions. So it's really valuable to hear from people who have good ideas. And I would never, as a constituent, don't ever undervalue an idea that you may have. A recent example, and this is a scoop, which not even announced yet, but we got approached by a constituent who asked about the possibility of the county building being lit up for Trans Day of Remembrance. And it was just a thing that wasn't on our radar yet, and it was literally, Nathan was highly supportive of that, and it was a phone call, and now it's happening, And then beyond that, just to speak to what the initial question was, there's no such thing as a perfect candidate. That's kind of what we've all been saying, but it's the blessing and the curse of a true democracy, right? There's no such thing as a perfect candidate. So, just to plug for this election without saying too much about my own beliefs, but I think that the vote this time is literally about letting our democracy continue to live another day. So get out there, encourage people to interact. The way that elections are seasonal, politics and your activism shouldn't be around that, right? I always look at November 3rd as just a deadline. Election season is now. And then, like what Tyler and Jessica were saying, and then after that, we continue to hold their feet to the fire. And that's how we balance that they're not the perfect person for us. That, and then it's just in phases and it's cycles. And if you're a nerd like me, it's exciting.
Josh, did you have anything to add?
Wow, that's a lot of really good. I would just say that Makana's point about November 3rd not being the end, right, of all this advocacy that we're seeing. I told someone the other day, a vote in this election means the real work can begin on November 4th. And I think to folks who might feel disillusioned, who might not see their issues being championed right now in Congress, in Sacramento, at the local level, that this is their way, right, to start making that ship turn around. And as many attacks on our community that we faced over the last 4 years, as many of those attacks that we faced, if we can start putting folks back in office who at a base level recognize our dignity, then we can put the real work in to start making more places like here in California, where we affirm folks, where we think that more access to something like healthcare is better than less. Who would have thought? And this year, everything from racial justice to the environment to our civil rights should be headed forward. And I think that we can change the direction that things have been going. And like Makana said, without saying too much about my own personal beliefs or Quality California's endorsement, we would just say to the folks who aren't registered, the 21% of LGBTQ folks who are not registered to vote, who aren't even in this discussion right now, you can register during early voting and on election day. We need your voices now more than ever.
Thank you so much. That is a great segue. We recognize that being eligible to vote is a privilege that not everyone in our community has. And folks' age, their documentation, parole, jail, or prison statuses can all impact their voting rights. So how can folks who don't have that privilege actively participate in our elections and our democracy, even if they can't fill out a ballot themselves?
I mean, I guess I'll start out with that one. I think, again, like I mentioned before, it's just engaging with, talking to your elected officials. You don't have to have voted for them to engage them. That's another thing that people think about. Well, I didn't vote for them, I'm not going to call them. And it doesn't matter if you voted for them or not. You can still call them and tell them what your opinion is or what legislation you want them to pass or what issues you want them to take up. I think, in being engaged, there's, you could be engaged on Facebook, you could be engaged socially, you can there's marches, there's everything that you need at your fingertips to stay engaged, even if you don't have a ballot in hand. And I think one of the things that we really, that I think people kind of miss now, and I really miss it myself too, is being able to sit with your family and have a, kitchen table discussion about politics and about what issues are important to you. I have that discussion with my family. My parents are green card holders, are not eligible to vote. But it doesn't mean they don't engage with their friends and their neighbors who are U.S. citizens who are eligible to vote on why they should be voting a certain way. I think those discussions can happen at a very micro level and it can happen to just your neighbor, your friend, whoever will listen to you, just to have that discussion. And I think people are just so overwhelmed by all the information they get, particularly up to election time. But I think people still really consider when, Jessica talks to your neighbor, because I've known you for 10 years, that you may have a different perspective about something that I didn't get in the, the voter ballot stuff or wherever. I trust that voice better than I trust something that I read somewhere else. And I think we have to really give credit and give value to that. And I think people can do that regardless if you're, a little kid or you're an adult and can't vote. I think we saw that really well played out with March for Our Lives. Those young people who could not vote have been on the forefront of changing gun violence because they were scared that they were going to be next and that they wanted to make sure that their voices as school-aged children or high schoolers were able to say no, that we've had enough and our legislators need to be held accountable for us and our safety. And I think, again, that happens at any level, regardless of you being able to vote or not.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point that there's a lot of organizations, community-based organizations that exist to advocate for certain issues, certain policies. So maybe you can't participate by voting, but you can participate in these other community-based issues that may fight for gun safety, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights. So get involved with a community-based organization because there's such power in numbers, and it's great to march and protest and sign petitions, but a lot of that work takes persistence and it takes connections, and sometimes an organization has those built in place that you can add your voice to, add your time to, add your insight to, and then it's even further amplified by that.
And beyond the community-based organizations, volunteer for candidates that you believe in. Volunteer for their campaigns. Right now, it's actually easier than ever with the COVID regulations. I've been doing lit drops and they're so fun. You don't even have to talk to anybody and walk around a neighborhood that you've never been to for a couple hours. And volunteer for candidates you believe in. Get involved with their campaigns.
I just want to really thank you, Janessa, for the question when you mentioned incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people. I think that's a really hot topic, finally, that we're having at a statewide level here in California. This year, California voters will have the chance to restore voting rights to folks who have formerly been unconstitutionally stripped of those rights. And California has the opportunity to make that right this year. I think that's very exciting as a voter. Also, those formerly incarcerated people, they still deserve a voice in legislation and processes that affect them. Another example at the state legislative level, Equality California co-sponsored a bill to help house transgender folks who are incarcerated according to the gender identity in which they feel safest, in the facility in which they feel safest. And what we saw were not only letters, but testimony from folks who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. These are folks who do not currently have voting rights, but are still using their voice. They are being empowered by great LGBTQ champions in Sacramento to make their voices heard at this level. And so even though they are not eligible voters, they're still having an impact on our policy. And I think that's crucial. Whether you are formerly incarcerated or you are a young person and you currently aren't involved in the kind of classical political system, there are ways to get around it and there are ways to make your voice heard.
And I'll just add one final thing before we move on to your elected officials and their policy teams, at least from my experience, are always looking for community-based activation projects. So if there's a policy that would help you, if it's, being a first-generation American and policies that would help you with access to voting and those sorts of things, bring them forward. Like Jessica was saying, like knock on your elected's door, reach out to their policy team, look on their team web pages, email those people too. It's not just the elected who can get in contact with you. We're constantly, it's a win-win-win for an elected when something that we're championing was brought to us from the community.
That's a great.
I will also add to that real quickly. I think one thing I tell people is if you have a compelling story, write it out. Write out that compelling story. Send it to us. We want to read it. We keep track of those things because if we're hearing stories from people who are compelling, we may use that story to try to convince someone else who we are having a hard time convincing that people who are in your situation and don't necessarily hear that voice from their own constituents, hear the voices that may be reflective of someone who's afraid to tell them in their own districts. So write them out, send them to us. There's so many times that I read stories where I am literally in tears because someone has such a fundamental appealing story, and those end up with Susan. Those end up with my member, and she may call them and talk to them about it, and because it's a personal connection with something versus something that's more general, because it really means something to that individual, and they were so motivated to get it to you because it was so compelling. And so write those stories out when you have them, write them out, send them around, and just share your experience with the issues that you're facing.
Thank you. Excellent
and I know
points.
As an advocate I'm so sorry. I just wanted to say to the three folks on here who do work with elected officials and government, to the people watching, these are the people who are fielding your comments, and that gives me, as an advocate and partner to a lot of these folks, a lot of comfort, because you have people with kind hearts, sharp policy minds who are going to put your comments to good use. So just thank you all, Jessica, for making that point.
Yeah, an excellent point. And thank you, Josh. And for those who are California voters, Josh mentioned the opportunity to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated people, and that is Proposition 17. So if you haven't educated yourself yet on that, I would encourage you to take a look. Okay, I just wanted to add one other thing. As a former advocate, I got my start as an advocate when I was 22 years old. I was suckered into attending a fly-in day, heading to Capitol Hill to go lobby on a foreign policy issue that I was really passionate about. And I had never been to Washington, D.C. before. I never met with an elected official. I had taken a bus from New York City to D.C. I had a skateboard under my arm and a JanSport backpack on. And I was so nervous walking into that office. I had a sheet with my talking points that an organization I was involved with had given me, and I kind of stumbled through them. The person I was talking to was probably, no offense, Jessica, but 10 years younger than you. It was a 25-year-old legislative assistant who was there. And at the end of our meeting, she looked up and saw all these students that were gathered in the office and said, "Look, we've been looking for a way to get engaged on this issue, and you've brought us an actionable item." And that member of Congress and Congress went on to go ahead and take our action that we'd requested. And so for me, that was a real light bulb moment, because before that, I thought, well, I have to be an expert to go into the room. I have to know all the policy points. And the reality is you don't. You just need to partner with an organization or entity that does know, and use your voice to make a difference. And it really, really can make a big change. So thank you guys for all of that amazing perspective. I really appreciate it. Okay, another question. We all know that 2020 has been completely untraditional in so many ways for all of us. Our current situations show that. But this is unfortunately having an effect on how the upcoming election will proceed. For example, every single voter in California received a mail-in ballot this year, because we are an awesome state and have universal mail-in voting. And here in San Diego County, everyone should have already received their mail-in ballots in the mail at the beginning of October. Can one of you share what viewers should do if they have not received their ballot in the mail in order to ensure they can participate in the November 3rd election?
Sure, I will take that one. So the Registrar of Voters has set up a website, sdvote.com, and you can actually track your ballot there. There's contact information, email, and phone number if you have not received it. Once you do receive your ballot, you can track it from the time you put it in the mail or drop it off at one of the 100+ officially designated ballot drop-off spots, not those fake ballot boxes that we see. And then it'll actually track your ballot until it is counted. So go to sdvote.com and you'll be able to track your ballot there.
And I asked the Registrar of Voters that Tyler's talking about as a county department, so I shot a quick email to ask them about, give me a couple bullet points that reassure people about the process. I'm just going to read it because this is what they said. I thought it was good. I don't want to misquote them, but they said they've been investing for years into the back-end process of mailing ballots. They have high-capacity mail sorting machines, digital adjudication, and high-speed scanners. They've added more of those this year than they've ever had before, including automated extraction machines. I don't exactly know what all of this means, but doesn't it sound reassuring? They're expanding operations to outside to address operational needs and social distancing during this time. And they're accepting Election Day postmarked mail ballots up to 17 days after the election, after Election Day this year. So they're doing a lot of new efforts to make sure that your vote is safe.
I just want to throw a plug in for our wonderful USPS. The mail is secure. Our mail carriers are efficient, and they're going to get your ballot to where it needs to go. I think, as we've seen, the administration has been talking about how we need the mail may not be safe. USPS continues and will continue to deliver your ballots to where they need to go. And as Tyler said, yes, SD Vote vote.com is probably the best place you can contact, look at their data. You can call them as well if you're better on maybe getting a phone call, talk to someone. I know they pick up their phones. If you want to drive your ballot to the drop-off locations, even including the county registrar of voters, they have. I think this year they have the line again, like they had in previous years, where you could just hand it over, with all social distancing protocols in place, and so you feel more secure. I, for one, love to go drop off my ballot because I love, making sure that I handed it to someone. I know it's official. I know it's an official mailbox. They're putting it there. I'm seeing all of this, but I mailed it and it's gone there perfectly as well too. So whatever you want to get, just make sure you vote. Make sure you vote and you get your ballot to the registrar of voters to make sure it counts.
And I'll just add a technical point. There are actually this year fewer locations, so your polling place may have changed. So you're going to want to double check that this year. There are actually 235 what they're calling super polling locations because they're going to be open for 4 days. It's from Halloween through November 3rd. On November 3rd, they actually expanded hours, so they're open 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then on October 31st through November 2nd from 8 to 5. So double check your polling location.
Excellent. And you can check that at iwillvote.com or go to the San Diego County registrar's office as well, voter registrar's office. Excellent. Okay, well, I think we actually have some time to open it up to audience questions. So I'm going to just throw that out there. If folks have questions they'd like to drop in the chat for the panel, I'm happy to do that. But as we kind of wait to see if we've got a question or two come in, I wanted to ask if any of you, either in your role as in constituent services, hearing from the community, or personally have a particularly impactful story about voting that you'd like to share.
I can add a story from a previous election. So I'm just thinking about how important voting is to make sure that like I mentioned earlier, that our elected officials are accurate representations of the communities that we live in. I will never forget in Obama's first term, when the results were announced that day, there was a lot, you could hear like yelling in the businesses. I was driving in my little downtown hometown, and I was in my car, and my windows were down. I looked over, and I was at a stop sign, and there was a black man on the sidewalk, and he looked over at me and said, "What happened? Did he win?" And I said, "Yes." And then he just started crying, and then I started crying, and it's just, I mean, those moments, make it worth the fight. So we're all in it together, and our voices, especially as the LGBT community, they matter. They matter.
I do want to share a personal story. I started working as a poll worker in Orange County when I was 16 years old, 16, 17, just to get involved in the election process. And I wasn't able to vote when Proposition 8 was being voted on in California. But I was helping this gentleman who was voting, but he was visually impaired. So he wanted me to double check his ballot. And I noticed that he voted against my rights, right? He voted yes on Prop 8. And I remember looking at that and saying, this person is voting against my rights as an individual. And from then on, I committed to voting in every single election because I couldn't vote at that time. So for people who can vote, know that you're not only just voting for yourself, you're voting for younger people, for undocumented folks. Your vote has a huge reverberation, and every single election matters. So that was my personal commitment, because that was a moment for me that I said, once I have the right to vote, I'm never going to miss an opportunity to do that.
I have a personal story as well. When in 2016, when I the big Hillary Clinton and Trump were on the presidential ballot, I actually voted ahead, and I left to Kenya for a safari trip that I was really looking forward to with one of my friends. And I landed in Kenya the day of the election. And it was very sad to see that, in fact, Hillary had not won, and that we had another president that I wasn't expecting. But the most traumatic part of that was, for me, is I had to kind of get over it really quickly, because we were going to enjoy this wonderful trip. but we went to a school in Kenya, and there was this little 6-year-old, 5-year-old, who first thing he says, like, "Why do you hate us?" And it still makes me kind of cry now about it, because he had no idea who Hillary or Trump were, but he knew that the person who got elected had a reputation for disliking people of color. And it was just devastating. I remember I started crying. I was just like completely overwhelmed with emotion that someone at that age in another country could feel that way about us and about me, pointing it directly at me, saying, "How could you hate us?" How do you explain that to someone, that we don't hate you, that it's not who I am or who we are? So I think that was really kind of solidified my thought of like, wow, we need to really work against this image that is going to be created that the United States hates people of color and hates people around the world. So it really kind of got to me like, this is how important this is. This is why 2020 needs to change, and it needs to reflect our actual values and who we really are as people.
Thanks, Jessica. Josh, did you have anything to add?
I have a lot of stories about voting. Most of them are just about being really tired. So I'll tell kind of an uplifting story about texting voters recently, which I love is becoming a tactic that we're using. It's super convenient, and right now it's keeping folks safe. But my team was texting some voters, and the replies that we got were asking for pictures and things like that. So texting can be a really fun experience, and I think that that's what's keeping me engaged right now is talking to people, connecting with them. But yeah, I would say that that's keeping me going right now.
Awesome. Yeah, and for those of you who haven't phone banked or text banked before for a candidate, it can be pretty overwhelming to pick up the phone and call a stranger. I totally get that. But what you'll find is most of the calls won't connect. A couple of them will, and you might get one person who yells at you, but overwhelmingly, you're going to be talking to people who are excited to hear from somebody, might need help figuring out where their polling location is, and that information is almost always provided to you by the campaign. There's a script you can follow. So, I was talking to a friend, I mentioned earlier, I'm helping out the Biden campaign, and one of my friends who's senior level organizer there at the campaign, I asked him yesterday, I've got a lot of friends who are asking me, like, what is it? I've thrown all the money I can at the campaign. What else can I do? And his response was, honestly, we need folks calling undecided voters in swing states. And so if you care about flipping the Senate or the presidential election, regardless of your party affiliation, I think those things would be true. So if you haven't gotten involved yet, it's not too late. There are gazillions of phone banks happening. Like I mentioned at the top of this, SD Pride is actually hosting them as well. And the link to sign up for those is sdpride.org/vote. And I'm sure somebody's going to drop it in the chat right now. But like I mentioned earlier, there is one at 5:30 p.m. today, and there's a few more going all the way through November 3rd. So I really hope you'll consider getting involved and participating in that way, regardless of whether or not you can personally vote. That is another way that you can be hugely impactful. So before we wrap this up, I just, SD Pride has brought us together for this panel today. And I think it's really important to recognize that our community, amongst our community, we have not always had the privilege of being able to express our voices openly, to express ourselves at the ballot box, to vote for people who look like us or represent us, who are allies. So what are, as we close out here, what are some of the challenges? Let's reflect on some of the challenges that have historically affected the LGBTQ plus voters' ability to vote. And what are some of the ways we can continue to address these challenges moving forward so that everyone has the opportunity to participate?
Well, I can start with an obvious one, in just the hurdles that trans people faced when their ID may not reflect who they are. That leaves it at the poll workers' discrimination whether they're going to allow them to vote or not, right? That's a huge hurdle amongst a part of our community that is the most marginalized. So that's why it's important to get involved with electeds who are going to be allies or who directly represent us so that we can make those changes to protect those people. It's like that adage, right, that when the most marginalized among us rises, we all do. So I think it's important to focus, who's the most affected community when you're looking at any policy, and then support them.
Mm-hmm. And Makana, just on that, Equality California this year has been partnering with the Secretary of State's office to actually update the entire state's poll worker training guidelines to make sure that the poll workers know how to, in a culturally competent way, treat and interact with transgender and gender nonconforming voters. And I think, again, that's California kind of leading the way. That's us showing that these people who have been historically marginalized from many processes, but especially voting, deserve to be included and feel comfortable doing so. And while voting by mail seems to be the popular choice of voting right now, we know that folks still need to, for health reasons, for ability reasons, still go to vote in person. And it doesn't just affect the LGBTQ community. It affects our folks with disabilities. It affects our seniors. And I think that when we vote for folks and are engaged with kind of that policy influence that Makana was talking about, we're helping our allies and other communities that so desperately need it as well.
Yeah, I think one of the impacts of COVID-19 is we're doing everything differently, and that includes voting. So while it's great that this election we've put more opportunities in place for people to vote, we need to push to make sure that that is sustainable and that we make these changes long lasting and that we make changes to our institution that allow more people to participate. And that includes voting, but that also includes city council meetings, county board meetings, how we get community input. So some of the benefits of doing everything differently now is that we're opening the gates a little bit more. We're allowing more access. We're making it more readily available for folks. And we need to make sure that we push for those to be long-term sustainable changes that we make so that we're hearing from as many voices as we can.
And we're starting to see some data about how disproportionately affected the LGBT community and all marginalized communities are. I forget who mentioned it earlier, but we're only just now starting to implement those like questions and markers and things like surveys and the census and polls to accurately reflect. So we don't even have a clear picture of how affected we are. My suspicion and my lived experience, and we probably would all agree, it's probably much worse even than the data is showing. So.
And I would just piggyback on that, that we in this call and as a larger community clearly represent other marginalized communities, communities of color, folks of different immigration status. And so when those communities are affected by voter suppression, as we're seeing unfortunately in other states, that is disproportionately affecting our community. And I think that that's just, it's so important to not only advocate for queer folks, but for our unfortunately marginalized neighbors.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for bringing that up. I was, when you mentioned earlier, Makana, thinking about who is the most affected, who is the most marginalized population. I think it's really important to remember to think about our community from an intersectional perspective and think about communities of color, Black people, the extreme lengths that our people are going to, parties are going to take people off voter rolls, to overturn efforts to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated folks. These are, they might not have a rainbow flag after their logo, but the organizations that are working on these things, these issues are our issues because, like Josh just said, our community is disproportionately affected when other marginalized communities are also ineligible to vote or rendered ineligible to vote. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think it's really awesome to see groups like, Human Rights Campaign partnering with Stacey Abrams' initiative to ensure that all folks can vote. And I think that we need to, as a community, the more we can expand that and really see ourselves as the forefront for bringing all civil liberties to all marginalized communities, I think that's really powerful. So thank you for that. Okay, we are getting down to the wire here. I just want to open it up for each of you to just some closing thoughts. And this is, I think, for many of us, the most important election of our lifetimes. In the next 2 weeks we have left. I would encourage everyone who's watching to leave it all on the line. Don't leave anything on the table. get out there, drop literature for a candidate you believe in, make phone calls, send texts. And if you can't do any of those things, at the very least, talk to your friends and your family and your chosen family, and make sure that those people have the tools and resources they need to have their voices heard and their votes counted. Because it's easy to think, oh, I don't have time to do that, because you know what? This is the real world. It's a really challenging time, and people have to go to work and take their kids to school, or do school in their homes. So I get it. If you are time and cash strapped, yeah, like that is a lot of people's lives. But having those conversations at the very least with your immediate friends and family, and ensuring that they have the tools and resources to make their voices heard, I think is something we can all commit to do. And I hope that you will join me in doing that with your own community. So with that, we'll go just sort of around the horn and closing thoughts. Jessica, I'll start with you.
Again, thank you for having this great conversation. San Diego Pride, thank you for hosting this, and Janessa, as always, a wonderful job as our moderator. I think my only closing thoughts is really make sure you vote your interests, look at what those interests is, and vote accordingly. And then just make sure that we don't wake up the day after the election saying, oh, I should have done blank. Let's do everything we can now before the election, so when we wake up the next day after election day, we're content with the fact that we did all we could to make sure that our interests were reflective in the people who were elected and the policies that were enacted. So just keep doing what you're doing. If not, like Jennifer said, do more.
Thanks, Jessica. Josh?
Yeah, again, thank you to San Diego Pride and to all of you. This has been a really fun conversation. The thing that is really striking me about the election this year is that it is happening with the backdrop of the reckoning of racial injustices that are happening not only in this country, but around the world. Folks who are aware of global politics see that this is happening everywhere. And I think what's important to do as you head to the polls is realize that you're not just voting for yourselves. You are voting for the most marginalized in our community. You're voting for your neighbors of color. You're voting for Black dreams and Black futures. And I think that it's that selflessness that we should all take with us to the polls or the mailbox, however you're voting, and that really motivates me to continue to stay involved, even if watching the news is a daunting and traumatic experience right now. That it's that kind of heart that's keeping me going. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Josh. Makana?
Yeah, thanks so much to San Diego Pride. This was really fun. I just want to quickly plug, it's not the season now, but I want to plug the importance of voting in primaries and in midterms and in special elections. Because fewer people tend to vote in those elections, our vote matters even more there. And especially, specifically in primaries, those tend to skew older and whiter votes. So we need to be showing up in those. The purpose of a lot of those elections are to move the stronger candidates forward. So you want to make sure that your voice is heard at that moment, because those primary voters skew much more partisan, and that's how sometimes we get these fringe candidates who move forward. So we want to be speaking up in the whole process. It's not just the election, season. So just to plug that, and thanks, Janessa.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Thanks, Makana. Okay, Tyler.
It is truly gratifying to be with all of you today and talk about the importance of voting. And one thing I want to leave with is consider a career in public service. I think Jessica and Makana, we can all relate that we were not political insiders when we, started our careers. Many of us came from the nonprofit world or from community-based organizations, and now we're at the table. And we need diverse voices like yours to be at the table with us. So this is where a lot of the work gets done at the staff level, at the policy level, and you can be a part of that. Post-election, there's going to be a lot of opportunities on the local level. So if you ever have any questions about how to get involved, how you can maybe make a career of public service, and that doesn't only mean working in government, that means a lot of different public policy opportunities, contact myself. I'm more than happy to be a resource, because the more diverse, the more inclusive we are as a government, the more effective we are at closing some of those gaps and making people feel less marginalized. So we need you. We need your heart, your intellect, your passion, your insight, and please consider that as a career.
I love that so much. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you to Jessica and Josh and Makana, all of you. We have now reached the end of this event, exactly 1 hour. We are on time, very exciting. Thank you so much again to all the panelists and for all of you for joining us on this live stream and sharing space with our LGBTQ community today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.